Look at how the sages deceitfully and brazenly created a completely new covenant. Exactly so, this is precisely what happened. I will now read to you the specific verse from the sacred book of Deuteronomy, which is found in chapter 25 at verse 11. If two men are fighting together, two men quarreling, and the wife of one of the men who are fighting with each other, comes to save her husband, to rescue her husband, and she reaches out her hand and grabs him by his private parts, grabs his testicles or his sexual organ. What is the punishment? You shall cut off her hand, you shall show no pity. So what does it actually say in the Torah, the book that believers believe was written by the one who created all the galaxies? That a woman who sees her husband fighting with another man and wants to save him, grabs the other man by the testicles or his sexual organ, cut off her hand, you shall show no pity. What does it mean to cut off her hand? It means to cut off her palm. Let me show you how the sages simply... Why do I call this chutzpah? Because they have no problem with explicitly contradicting the written text. Look, in Tractate Bava Kama, page 28a, it says the following. Tashma bochma, and you shall cut off her hand, compensation, money. Do you get the joke now? What does compensation mean? How do we assess the amount of money? Rashi says in his commentary on the verse, we assess his shame. Since she grabbed the man's private part, we estimate how much his embarrassment is worth, how much he was shamed. What is the connection between cutting off the hand and the monetary value of the man who was shamed, whose private part she grabbed? So I say this is brazen deceit. As if, in a blunt and crude way, they turn the Torah into something trivial, into something meaningless, and as if it's some kind of dough you can do anything with. Then here we're talking about laws that you believe God himself wrote. Do you understand this deceit of the new covenant here? Now, Professor Yeshayahu comes up in the covenant in contrast. Now, I will also read to you from the Vilna Gaon. He had integrity and he said explicitly, okay, pay attention. I am reading to you from his book, Judaism, the Jewish People and the State of Israel. Here on page 21, he says the following. The relationship between the Bible and the oral Torah, the halakha of the oral Torah is a human creation. What is written here in the Talmud is a human creation, because these are things spoken by people. It draws its authority from the living words of God found in the Bible. That is the first deception, but Professor Leibowitz does not say. Where do you draw your authority from, the words of God? From where? By deception. They drew it by deception. But after they deceitfully drew their authority from the living words of God in the Bible, what now? Their authority, they determined it themselves. Pay attention. But it is they who determine what its content is, what its meaning is, what its interpretation is, and what the meaning of the written Torah is. They drew authority by deception, and they decide its meaning, the limits of interpretation. What is the meaning of the limits of interpretation? It's not just the limits of interpretation. It's you will pay. Money, you will pay money, as if God doesn't know how to say, pay compensation for shame. No, you shall cut off her hand, your eye shall not pity, means that you will pay compensation for the shame. What a distortion, what a perversion, what audacity this is. Now let's reinforce these points. Besides the fact that the Torah was actually written in ancient times, an ancient culture where the punishment is measure for measure, an eye for an eye. If you grab someone by the hand, we'll cut off your hand, to reinforce that this is what it's really talking about. In ancient laws, so I'll quote for you from the scientific commentary on the Bible for Israel, which brings the laws of Middle Assyria. And I'll read it all to you because it's very relevant, so that you'll also get to know the ancient culture and understand that the entire Torah consists of laws suited to the ancient era and are not relevant to our times. Simply not relevant. If she tries to save her husband and grabs the other man's testicles, we won't cut off her hand. What can we do? So it says like this in the Laws of Middle Assyria, section 7 through 8, Law Collections, page 186. If a woman reaches out her hand to a man and her guilt is proven, as in, it's proven that she reached out her hand to a man, she shall pay 30 minas of lead as a fine, and she shall receive 20 lashes with whips. Okay? That's only if she reached out her hand to a man. But if a woman truly crushes a man's testicles during a particularly intense fight, during a prolonged struggle, then they shall indeed cut off one of her fingers. So here you clearly have, it's explicitly stated, if she only grabbed and didn't actually injure him in any significant way, then she has to pay a monetary fine. However, if she completely crushes one of the testicles, then they will definitively cut off one of her fingers as a direct consequence. Which is basically the culture of the ancient world, cutting off fingers, cutting off hands, or gouging out an eye or a tooth. And the purpose is to reduce the number of people who would harm one another. That's the rationale. Now, look at how the Vilna Gaon somehow reinforces this deception without even realizing it, just speaking innocently. He reinforces what I'm saying with this vile deceit of Chazaka. Pay attention, he writes. The Vilna Gaon wrote a book called Aderet Eliyahu. Because his name is Rabbi Eliyahu, so he called it Aderet Eliyahu. He says about the verse like this, Halakha overrides the scripture. He measures. The plain meaning of the verse, at the height of the attack, or an eye for an eye, it means an eye for an eye, not money. And he says, Halakha overrides the scripture. And so it is in several passages in the Torah, in many passages in the Torah, Halakha, that is, the sages, uprooted what is written. And now here begins the trickery. And this is from the greatness of our oral Torah, which is Halakha given to Moses at Sinai. What is this thing? And it turns like clay under a seal. Is this Halakha given to Moses at Sinai? So God came at the height of the attack, explained to Moses orally that the intention is the monetary value of the injured. What Moses would say to him, tell me, then why? For all these years you told us not to write an eye for an eye and to pay money according to the damage. It's the same number of words, we don't appreciate it. What is it? What is this essence that it's a halakha given to Moses at Sinai? Now I'll finish with an amazing revelation that the Rambam in his heart, and maybe even in his mind, is a kind of Karaite. Pay attention, it's amazing. Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 41. I'm quoting from it. Next statement. The commandments that are punishments, meaning like the loss of assault, the loss of damages, their general benefit is known. This punishment, that you punish someone who harms his fellow, its benefit is known. And then he explains. He explains that someone who destroys a limb, they do not lose the same as him. That is, if you damage your friend's eye, they take your eye. In other words, Maimonides explains in the Guide for the Perplexed that an eye for an eye is to be understood literally. When a person inflicts a blemish on another, so shall it be done to him. He quotes the verse from the Torah. And then he goes down. The Guide for the Perplexed was written to Rabbi Yehuda. He tells him, and do not trouble. Now look, pay attention. Listen to what Maimonides says, who is basically a Karaite. And do not trouble your mind over the fact that here we punish with monetary compensation. That is, what the sages said is that it is monetary. Do not trouble your mind that it is monetary. Why? Because the intention is to give a reason for the verses for what is written in the scripture, not to give reasons for the oral Torah. That is, Maimonides understands. He even belittles the oral Torah. Because he says the intention is to give a reason for the verses, not to give reasons for the oral Torah. And what is the reason for the Torah of the scripture? an eye for an eye in order to, so that people will not cause harm, to instill fear, to impose punishment. That is the benefit of an eye for an eye. That is the benefit of cut off her hand, so that a woman will not come and grab another man's private parts. But the point I want to explain here about the Rambam is that he ignores the sages, and therefore you can understand how the Rambam relates to the Talmudic rabbis, those who know the entire Talmud. He writes in the treatise on the resurrection of the dead that they are fools because there is no philosophy in the Talmud. In the Talmud, they refer to God as if he has a body and a physical form, something that the Rambam, in his Guide for the Perplexed, says is heresy. Anyone who thinks this way is a heretic. In other words, the sages are fools who may know the laws or invent new ones, and the Talmudic rabbis also know the laws of Choshen Mishpat, the laws of Nida, the laws of family purity, and the laws of Shabbat. And that's what they're tested on, and that's what brings them joy when they become rabbis. But they never learned how to think, they never learned to understand what this is really about. Because anyone can know the laws of the sukkah, you just need to know them. What is the maximum permissible height of a sukkah? Ta-ta-ta-tam. What is the minimum height of a sukkah? Ta-ta-ta-tam. These are simple things that anyone can know. But something systematic, not at all. So what do we end up with? We end up with the fact that in practice, the sages, even Professor Schulbe, both the Gra from Vilna and the Rambam, everyone agrees that, in essence, the oral Torah determines the meaning of the written Torah. And in practice, they did this so thoroughly that the Rambam ignores the interpretation of the oral Torah when he speaks about philosophy. Although when he writes the Mishneh Torah, the laws and the Halachot, he writes according to the oral Torah, but in his heart of hearts, that is, as a thinking person in philosophy, that's not it. And besides that, I believe that Hamas needs to be eliminated.